Test, test, test. The Nikon ZR is a confusing camera. On a surface, I do love using this thing. It's tiny, it has a lot to offer, fantastic image quality, an abundance of internal RAW codecs, including the headline-grabbing Red NE, that gorgeous 4-inch screen, and of course 32-bit float audio, all for the crazy price of $2,000. But while this impressive spec sheet may grab headlines, can it really tie all of these elements together in a cohesive package, one that is ready for prime time and demanding client work? I think it would be fair to say that this is a camera that I both love and hate, maybe hate is a strong word, dislike at times. So I'm going to unpack some of these messy and conflicting feelings around this camera and get to the bottom of what I really think about it and whether it's right for you. So I'm going to share a ton of sample footage, side-by-side comparisons, and perhaps some surprising opinions. So let's get into it. First things first, the image quality coming out of the Nikon ZR is exceptional, even more so for a camera of its price and size. Whether you choose to use Nikon or Red colors, the image that comes out of this camera is probably one of the best of a camera I've ever used at this size and price point. And with an optical low pass filter, the image has a delicate balance of sharpness and detail. There are one or two caveats which we'll get on to later. But generally, whether you're shooting in the Red color space or in Nikon N-Log, the footage from this camera is just really nice to grade. All the images you'll see in this video will either be Rec 709 or graded with my Hackney LUT and Power Grade, and I'm soft launching this now with this video with an awesome discount that will be available for the next few weeks. You can pick it up as either a LUT pack or as a Power Grade that also includes the LUT pack, and because I'm such a nice guy, the package will include LUTs that cover you for both Nikon and Red footage. The ZR just has an abundance of internal recording formats. You've got 12-bit NRAW, which is available in both a standard and high quality mode. You've got a 12-bit ProRes RAW, you've got ProRes. Of course, you've got the beautiful 12-bit Red NE codec and a 10-bit 420H.265 codec, and also you can record in 8-bit as well. One of the highlights of this camera has to be its NRAW. Yes, you heard me, NRAW. When this camera was first announced, of course, the inclusion of the Red NE codec caused a lot of headlines, and I think it caused a lot of people to overlook the NRAW offering in this camera, myself included. And unlike the Red NE, it actually offers a compressed version that is much more usable in day-to-day work. And we'll look at it a little bit later on, but I actually think the NRAW in this camera is one of the strongest features it has to offer. Unfortunately, the H.265 in N-Log on this camera isn't up to scratch. Isolated on its own, it's maybe passable, but as soon as you hold it up against something else, including its own internal RAW formats, you can see just how soft and smeary it is. So I don't know what really happened here. It looks like either overzealous noise reduction or perhaps some kind of throttled encoding issue. But I'm not super happy with the quality of the H.265 that comes out of this camera. And you can see just how much difference there is in the detail on the H.265 clip. It looks very mushy. Look at the texture in the hat. And when we punch in, you can really see the differences here. In this example, I just used ProRes RAW and Red RAW, but it's the same for NRAW as well. That also has a good level of detail. People have pointed out that when you shoot in hybrid log gamma, that you don't get the same loss of detail and quality, and that does appear to be true. When you shoot in hybrid log gamma, you also get access to an additional tool set of image adjustment or image quality adjustment dials, which include a lot of different sharpening controls that you don't get with N-Log. If you turn all sharpening down to 0, you're still getting a slightly more detailed image than you would from the N-Log version. And oddly, this issue is also seen when you're capturing in N-Log when shooting in ProRes. So I was kind of curious what might be going on here, so I opened up the files in QuickTime to inspect their bit rates, and this offered a few clues as to what might be happening. The N-log files have a dramatically lower bit rate, whereas the SDR and hybrid log gamma files have much higher bit rates. So the SDR has something like 116 megabits per second, and the HLG has 160 megabits per second. So I guess one of two things might be happening here. Either the N-log files are strangely capped with a much lower bit rate, and that's causing the loss of detail and smeariness, or what I suspect might be happening is that the N-log files for some reason have super aggressive noise reduction applied to them in the post-processing, causing a reduction in detail, which has a knock-on effect for a variable bitrate encoding, which, because it has less detail to deal with, just ends up recording less data as a result of this. So the fix, I guess, for this in firmware would be just to eliminate any of the post-processing on these files, or if it is a capped encoder, just address that. Both of these things I think can be addressed with firmware and aren't hardware limited. The only question would be is, if you remove that noise reduction, what happens to that H.265 file? Is it a noisy mess? Because it is a little bit strange that Nikon would ship this camera in this state. Regardless of this, across the board, the bit rates for these files are relatively low if you compare them to other cameras. For example, my LUMIX S1 Mark II in 5.8K 16:9 records at a bit rate of something like 300 megabits per second, so over double what the Nikon ZR is capturing in its H.265 modes. Whether this is actually an issue for you is kind of down to you. I think the H.265 from this camera is probably fine for simple social media content, YouTube, stuff like that, but in terms of client work, I probably wouldn't use it myself. As a camera marketed as a professional cinema camera, the H.265 is likely always going to be its most used recording codec, so to release it in such a compromised state is strange. So if you want to find out a little bit more about this, I definitely recommend checking out Philip Bloom's excellent in-depth video about this, and he compares it to the Nikon Z6 Mark III, which also shares the exact same sensor as this camera, but renders a very different image when it comes to the H.265 N-log. Okay, let's look at some dynamic range tests across the different codecs and different base ISOs. As always, we'll expose the scene for middle grey, and then we'll overexpose the camera in one-stop increments, and then underexpose it in one-stop increments, and then in post, bring it back to that baseline to see what happens to the highlights and to the shadows in terms of noise and clipping. Whilst we look at that footage, I'm going to tell you about today's sponsor, which is Audio. All the music in this video comes from Audio's high-end catalogue, produced by real artists and composers. With an Audio Pro membership, you get a single license that covers you for practically everything from YouTube monetization, social media projects, and even commercial work for clients under 100 employees. Any track you download during your subscription period is licensed to that project forever, even if you cancel your plan later on. Audio also has some of the best AI search tools which speeds up music discovery. This includes Hans AI, a text-based assistant, and also Link Match, where you can paste in links from other platforms to find quick music matches. And of course, Audio also has Elements, which allows you to break each track down into its individual stems. But I also have an incredible discount to give you, up to 70% off your first year of an Audio Pro plan, and this includes unlimited music, unlimited sound effects, and also the AI search tools. So head over to the link below and use the code PROSSER to get your first year of an Audio Pro plan for the crazy price of $59. In underexposure, noise tends to show up between 2 to 3 stops of underexposure, but the quality of the noise is actually pretty nice. It's quite grain-like. It's quite uniform. It doesn't have any sort of like weird sort of banding or fixed pattern noise that you see on cameras like the Pixis. It's quite sharp and well defined in all of the modes apart from H.265, where it's quite smeary and blotchy. And as you underexpose an H.265, the noise reduction that applies to that noise pattern just sort of further obscures detail and sort of degrades the image. But the biggest issue I'm seeing here is flickering in the shadows, and this turns up across all modes, and I believe it is a known issue that has shown up in other Nikon cameras, including the Z6 Mark III, which shares the same sensor. But to me, this is a huge issue. It turns up at around 2 to 3 stops. I think if you're pulling your shadows down in post, then it will hopefully obscure it, but if you're not doing that or even pulling your shadows up, it's going to be a huge issue for you, and this is something that Nikon really need to address quickly because it's not something I've ever really seen before in any other camera system. But what's most nuts is when you shoot in the high base in ProRes RAW, you get this. It looks absolutely nuts. It's like whole frame flickering and flashing. It flashes green and magenta. I don't know what's causing this, but it's kind of crazy. It shows up at around 2 stops and becomes almost unusable by 3 stops of underexposure. And so I would just recommend avoiding shooting anything in the high base ISO in ProRes RAW on this camera at all costs until Nikon addresses this. Hopefully they will address it because it's not really acceptable and it shouldn't be happening. So what's interesting in this camera is that in most cinema cameras, shooting in high ISOs actually gives you more range in the highlights, and then lowering the ISO gives you better shadow performance and less noise. With this camera, it's a little bit different. It seems that in the low base ISO of 800, you get better highlight performance, so shoot in ISO 800 if you want to preserve highlights. But for low light and for shadow performance, it actually looks like you're better off shooting in that higher ISO level 6400. And you'll tend to find that highlights clip between 3 and 4 stops of overexposure. Between NRAW and R3D NE, I find that the red codec tends to have a smidgen more range in the highlights. If you look at the specular highlights on the briefcase, the red just holds those a little bit more, whereas there's just a little bit more clipped in the NRAW file. And then with the H.265, I'd say you get just a little bit less range in the highlights compared to the RAW codecs. In terms of like other comparable cameras, my Komodo I think gave over 4, maybe even 5 stops before it clipped, as well as the LUMIX S1 Mark II. In real world scenarios, how that will play out is if you were shooting next to a Komodo or a LUMIX S1 Mark II, is that bright areas of the image would just clip a little sooner than those other cameras, so maybe stuff like windows or areas of the sky. The image coming out of the ZR is incredible, but it's not quite up to the levels that I get out of my Komodo. And that would be to expected. That's fair. I understand that. I'm cool with that. As you'll see, there are some differences between the way that the Komodo and the ZR renders their image. The ZR does seem to have a bit of a warmer tone, a bit of a warm cast. Look at the back drapes, they definitely push a lot warmer on the ZR, whereas they are much more neutral and white on the Komodo. And just overall, I find that the Komodo has much better color reproduction and separation between color tones. Something I've always loved about the Komodo, that even when you underexpose it, it still reproduces colors brilliantly, whereas the ZR does suffer from this yellowish greenish tint across the image. And this does muddy the colors somewhat. However, the image is 80% there, I would say, and it's a fantastic starting base with only a few minor tweaks required to get these two images matching. And the red raw image coming out of the Nikon ZR is undeniably much nicer than what I get from my internal recordings on my LUMIX cameras. And this is something I just really picked up on when I was testing the 40mm TT Artisan lens. I had a copy both for the ZR and the LUMIX S1 Mark II, so these cameras both share the same sensor, but I did much prefer the quality of image that I pulled off the Nikon ZR over the LUMIX. Now, I was obviously capturing in red raw on the ZR and then comparing this to the H.265 on the LUMIX, so it's not a totally fair comparison. But there was just something a little undeniably nicer and maybe richer about the red footage over that LUMIX footage, which at times felt a little over-processed, a little too harsh and digital. It's less of a competition when it gets to B-RAW or ProRes coming out of the LUMIX cameras, but certainly those internal images do not look as nice as the red RAW coming from the ZR. Unfortunately, the Nikon ZR doesn't have the best dynamic range in terms of other cameras in its class, but I think for the most part it's fine. Like, I'm prepared to sacrifice a little bit of that for, you know, the quality of the image that you can get from this and the form factor. When I'm out and about and I'm shooting in red raw, I just noticed that the ZR clips a little sooner than what I would expect on my LUMIX cameras. Shadows are sometimes a little bit more noisier, and I'll see noise a little bit sooner again than I would expect to see on one of my LUMIX cameras. But you know, it's a raw workflow, so some noise is to be expected, but even when comparing it with the raw output from my LUMIX cameras, I would say the Nikon ZR is just a little bit more noisy. So I highlighted an issue with moire in my first impressions video, and I don't want to go over too much old ground here, but one of my hopes for me with the Nikon ZR is, because it's a 6K camera, that I could shoot in 4K full frame in Red RAW and, you know, just get some smaller file sizes and not really have to make any sacrifices or have to crop into the sensor like I have to on my Komodo. Obviously, this is possible, but it does come with a huge drawback, in that the camera applies quite aggressive line skipping when it downsamples from 6K to 4K to output the 4K RAW image. And this can cause some pretty gnarly and aggressive aliasing and artifacting and moire and interference patterns, and it just doesn't look great if you've got anything with texture or patterns in the frame. You might be okay with this. If you're shooting in soft focus, shallow depth of fields, you might get away with it, but it's definitely a bit of a gamble. But even when you shoot in full frame, 6K, RAW, even with its optical low pass filter, I was still surprised to see moire turning up in my footage, especially when I was shooting architecture or buildings or anything like that. So just be careful if you are using this camera for architectural work. Another pleasant surprise in this camera is that you can shoot up to 120 frames a second in Red RAW in 4K with a Super 35 crop, which I think is exceptional for a camera of this size and form factor. Like, it kind of blew my mind that we get this. And it also looks good. There aren't really sort of massive sacrifices that you have to make to capture in 120 frames. As you are cropping in, obviously there's a bit of hit to dynamic range performance and noise performance, but having access to those frame rates in a solid RAW codec on a camera of this price and size with autofocus still works, is frankly impressive and is exactly the sort of thing that we should applaud Nikon for in this camera and in this offering. Like, I definitely don't get anything close to that on my Red Komodo, so it's crazy that we get this on the ZR. Of course, in 6K full frame, you also get up to 60 frames a second. Again, I don't get that on my Komodo. You might get it on the Komodo X, and that's obviously available with no crop as well, which again is very impressive. A lot of the early reviews and videos around the Nikon ZR seem to make a lot of noise about the noise in this camera. So I was prepared for the worst, and honestly, while it can get a bit noisy, it absolutely is nowhere near as bad as I thought it would be. I've mostly been shooting in R3D NE, which I guess is one of the noisier codecs because it doesn't have any internal image processing, and I only generally shoot in the native ISOs, which are 800 and 6400. Generally, I found both to be pretty clean, to be honest, from what I gather, and like most cinema cameras, it's actually recommended you shoot dark scenes at the higher base ISO rather than lowering the ISO to as low as you can go. And generally just overexpose the camera as much as possible to keep that noise at bay. But generally in my testing, I got pretty decent results shooting at 6400 ISO, which to be honest is pretty high. You know, it's much higher than I'd ever find myself shooting on my Komodo or my Pixis or even on my LUMIX cameras. It's again a pretty cool feature to have a sort of a dual base ISO system on a Red RAW capable camera, and again at this price point. And it just gives you a little bit more flexibility and some great options when it comes to low light recording. We've got a gorgeous R3D NE RAW image that comes out of this camera. It doesn't have the best dynamic range, but we can live with that if only it wasn't for one major issue: data rates. So I think if you're looking at getting this camera specifically for the R3D NE, this is probably going to be the most important section that you should watch, because I really don't think a lot of people have walked this down the road to understand the long-term storage requirements of shooting long-term in a codec like R3D NE. So just a quick recap, the Red Komodo and all of the Red cameras for that matter, they have various flavors and compression ratios of Red RAW. So on the Komodo you get HQ, MQ, LQ and ELQ, and they will have different data rates. Most people will tend to shoot probably between LQ and maybe ELQ. So on an average shoot day, shooting an LQ, ELQ, you'll get around 1 terabyte, maybe a little bit more of footage. The R3D NE in the ZR has a crazy data rate that's edging towards the levels of HQ on my Komodo. I don't think many people are shooting in HQ on the Red cameras, and to have such a chunky RAW codec on such a small, affordable camera, for me, it's just bizarre. You're capturing almost twice the data rates that you would probably be capturing on your Komodo. A 1TB card on the Nikon ZR will net you, I think, around 1 hour 20 of record time, and that's 6K 25 frames a second. So if you're shooting a couple of 45-minute interviews in a day, or maybe a couple of 1 hour interviews in a day, to be on the safe side, you're going to need probably 3 or 4 1TB CF Express cards, maybe even more, if you want redundancy in case one goes down. And I've not really seen many people step through the practicalities of this post workflow for a camera like this. Say conservatively you capture 2 to 3 terabytes a day and your project is 3 shoot days, that's up to 9 terabytes from a single project from a single camera. Then you add in the backup, that's 18 terabytes you're looking at for this one project. So what happens now if you're adding a second camera like the Komodo, you're adding more data to that? What happens if you're shooting multiple concurrent projects in a month with this camera? It just really starts to add up. And I think in your average month, if you have a busy month, you're easily going to start pushing over like the 100 terabyte territory when you factor in backup. And likely over 1 or 2 years of regular use, it's going to cost you thousands of extra dollars in extra storage. And that's not even factoring in the skyrocketing cost of storage at the moment. It's kind of like a perfect storm acting against the use of this camera and this codec. Now, I'm sorry that's a bit of a rant, it was a bit of a detour, but I really wanted to get this in the video so people could truly understand the ramifications of using this camera and the practicalities of using this camera. I really hope that Nikon can address this and push a compressed version of this codec out in the camera in a firmware update, but again, I'm kind of concerned that it might be a hardware limitation, and without active cooling or a beefier processor, maybe it's just not going to happen. However, the saving grace for this camera perhaps is that it can also shoot in NRAW, and it does come with a slightly more compressed format, which is much more convenient to shoot in than the Red NE, but you sacrifice the sort of red color science, which again kind of doesn't make sense to me. I didn't buy the Nikon ZR to shoot in NRAW. Or did I? The more I shoot in NRAW, the more I love it. So for an equivalent 1 terabyte, you get over 2 hours record time in the standard quality, whereas you only get around 1 hour and 20 with Red NE. And although you're not getting Red's characteristic color science, the image coming out of NRAW is still beautiful, and like most log profiles today, it's very easy to match it up to pretty much any other camera that you want. And who knows whether Nikon will add a compressed red format to the camera. Until they do, or if they don't, the NRAW is a very workable, flexible codec, and one that I would actually be happy to shoot in going forwards over the Red NE. I think I'd far rather go through the effort of coming up with a color workflow to match my Nikon ZR to my Red camera than having to deal with the additional amount of data that comes from the Red NE. So although it might be the Red NE that attracts you to this camera, it might be the Nikon NRAW that persuades you to stick around. Some have suggested a workaround where you shoot in the lower quality NRAW and then rename the NRAW to a Red file in post, and then import it into your video editing software, and then that will magically turn it into a Red RAW file, which it doesn't. If this was true, we could rename the NRAW file, bring it into Resolve, and pull it up next to our identical Red NE clip, and you expect the two to look the same, which they don't. They look very different with different color saturation and hues. They are not the same clip. It's different data. You're not getting an original Red code encoding in your file. If you rename the file extension, you're just pushing the existing NRAW data through the Red color pipeline, but that data is still coming from an NRAW file, an NRAW encoded file. And you're just brute forcing the color changes similar to a color space transform in Resolve. You're not magically achieving R3D with this little so-called hack. So I love the form factor of the Nikon ZR. It's fantastic, and honestly the novelty of having a tiny Red RAW capable camera that can slip into bags has definitely not worn off yet. Now, in terms of using this camera in the heat of the moment, the menu systems in this camera are frankly awful. I mean, most of the major brands have the same issue. The problem with the Nikon ZR is that it has this particularly sort of minimalist design. It doesn't have many physical buttons and dials. So it does really expect you to interact with your menus and settings using the big touchscreen. But unfortunately, Nikon just didn't bother to sort of redesign their user interface with this in mind, so you're forced into using that sort of traditional mirrorless camera menu system UI, and you know, it does have this tiny little joystick here, but it's wildly inaccurate and fiddly, and just sort of trying to quickly dial stuff in with this touchscreen, it's just a bit of a pain in the ass, to be honest. So I really wish that at some point Nikon, maybe in the Mark II or with some nice chunky film update, does consider just completely refreshing the video user interface. The same goes for most other camera brands. You know, it's only really Blackmagic that has designed its user interface system from the ground up with the intention of it being used with a nice big touchscreen. Now, other features of this camera, like the micro SDI and, you know, the memory card being in the battery compartment, those are things I can live with. They're minor frustrations. They're not deal breakers for me. The memory card thing, it slows you down a little bit. It is a bit frustrating, but again, not a deal breaker, considering like the size and the price of the camera. As I picked up in my first impressions video, I really don't like the record button on here. It's a bit of a design flaw in my opinion. It's kind of got what I assume is a kind of like stills camera shutter style button, and it needs to be a single press button for video work. So similar to you have on the front here, you just press that once and it triggers record, but you really have to jam this in to trigger record, and it just leads to lots of missed opportunities where you think you've triggered record and you just haven't pressed it hard enough. But on the flip side of that, this little rocker that is next to the record button here is absolutely fantastic, and it's used to sort of punch in to zoom to help you acquire focus when you're using manual focus lenses, and it just works so well, and it's in the perfect position, and it's so quick and efficient to use when you're out there shooting in the heat of the moment and you just really need to quickly punch into the image, and you can acquire focus very quickly. But then the other issue is that it lacks focus peaking when shooting red raw with a LUT applied. And it's kind of like par for the course of this camera. Like for every feature that it has, or every innovation it has one or two annoying features that sort of hold it back. You know, as a cinema branded camera, it is fundamentally missing some features in terms of exposure tools. Everyone's mentioned this in their videos, but false color I think is criminally missing from this camera. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Like, this shouldn't be a premium feature in 2026. Brands like LUMIX have found a way to add false color into all of their new cameras across the price range. And if Nikon want to be a serious player in a cinema space, they need to continue to innovate and push the boundaries at all levels. And the same is true for anamorphic features too, which are also criminally missing from this camera. Now, I'm not asking for something like OpenGate, but again, we've got this beautiful monitor on it. At least give us internal anamorphic D-squeeze. Now, a lot of people might say, Ed, it's a $2,000 camera. Why can't you just rig it up with an external monitor to get false color and D-squeeze? And I would say that just, why would you go to the effort of putting in such a beautiful large screen on a camera like this if you're then just going to force users into using a workflow that negates the use of this, messes up the whole balance of this little camera, and having to put up with a micro HDMI port to rig it up with a monitor? If I had to do that, I would probably just opt to use a different camera entirely, one that has fewer compromises than a little camera like this. I mean, of course, on the latest update, they did include a new exposure line on the histogram and waveform, but honestly, this just felt like a bit of a quick fix, and it's not really that useful. If you use this camera for any length of time and you use either of the histogram and waveform, you get really used to quickly eyeballing where that clipping point is anyway. You know, IBIS on this camera is okay. You know, I've been spoiled for many years using LUMIX cameras, and, you know, the Nikon doesn't come close to that at all. Mostly I've been using the IBIS on this camera in sports mode, and that allows you to have a little bit of movement. But oftentimes if I do have a lot of movement and I am on a wider lens, I'll just turn the IBIS off to get a cleaner image and just live with some of that natural camera shake. And finally, the access to 32-bit float audio recording functionality on this camera is just fantastic, and it's just a prime example of Nikon pushing boundaries with this camera. And honestly, all future camera releases and hybrid mirrorless cameras should come with 32-bit float internal recording capabilities as standard. The only other thing I could ask from Nikon is perhaps an XLR top handle, or even just a top module, which would allow me to use XLR connections and professional mics and make use of the beautiful 32-bit float in this camera. So since getting the Nikon ZR, I've been testing a few different lenses out on this camera. So originally I picked it up with this. This is the Nikon Z 35mm f1.4, and it's nice. It's a sort of modern, clean, sharp lens, and for the money it's okay. It has a sort of manual aperture ring. It's not manual, it's electronically controlled, and a focus ring. There's no manual or autofocus switch on this, which I think it should have for lens even at this price point. But honestly, if I'd known about it sooner, I wish I'd picked the camera up with this. This is the TT Artisan 40mm f2 lens. I just put out a review on it, and it is a crazy cheap lens for the Z mount. It's $168. It's f2, and it has autofocus as well as a manual aperture ring, but this one is clicked, which I don't know, just feels quite nice. But the image on this is a lot more closer to a sort of vintage lens. It's much more interesting in my eyes, and I much prefer the look of this lens over the Nikon 35mm. And this is just a perfect lens if you want to stick the ZR onto a gimbal. So I took it out over Christmas with the DJI RS3 Mini, and I was just kind of blown away at this tiny little portable setup on a tiny gimbal with red raw and autofocus. And I think moving forwards for client jobs, whenever I need a red camera on a gimbal, the ZR will be that camera with this lens. Finally, the other lenses I've been testing with the Nikon ZR are these. These are the 5-box Mirror C lenses, tiny cinema lenses, all t1.5, and they are fantastic. They do have a bit of focus breathing, but I'm prepared to live with that. They pair perfectly with the Nikon ZR in terms of size and form factor, and they produce a fantastic, beautiful image. If you are interested in picking these up, there's a full set that you can get with 5 focal lengths. I have a discount, an affiliate code down below if you want to pick these up. Okay, so after all of that, what do I think about the Nikon ZR? Well, I think for like a daily driver, for my content creation side of life, I really love this thing. It's fun, it inspires me, I love taking it out to shoot on. In terms of my professional client work and production business, I'm a little bit more on the fence of how I can use this on a weekly basis. Obviously, you've got the slightly compromised H.265, and I think that's the priority fix that Nikon need to address more than anything else on this camera. Next, obviously, the bloated red NE codec. At the moment, I think it's prohibitively expensive to use that on a weekly basis in any sort of sensible production workflow. Nikon really do need to put in a more compressed version of their red NE codec into this camera, at least something at the level of the Nikon NRAW offering. As a bonus, I don't think they will, but I think it would be awesome to open up the use of the red color science across all codecs in this camera. That would be a nice little Brucey bonus. And then finally, just tweak some of the exposure tools. I would love to see false color as standard in this thing. And again, as a juicy bonus, it would be amazing if they could find some way to add in Red's excellent exposure and traffic light tools into this camera. And I think if they can address all of these issues in the first year of its release, then this camera goes from a bit of a punk to being an absolute mainstream beast that I think would be unrivaled at this price point and at this kind of form factor of camera. If you're interested in buying this camera to pair it up with a larger red setup, yes, absolutely you can do that, and this camera offers some incredible features that you don't get on those larger cameras. You get the red color science, obviously, so the image is going to match with your red cameras, and obviously you get the form factor, so if you need to fly a camera on a small gimbal setup, this is going to be your man. However, you probably are going to have to put up with some workarounds to deal with the red NE footage, and that's most likely going to involve transcoding the rushes into something more usable like ProRes or even H.265. However, I do think the NRAW in this camera is its silver lining and maybe its saving grace. If you're willing to sacrifice the internal red color science in order to get something a little bit more workable in terms of file sizes, then the NRAW from this thing is a really workable option in terms of what you're getting from a file size to image quality and post flexibility ratio. It looks beautiful, and I can easily see myself giving up on the red NE and just using the NRAW on this thing when I shoot with this camera next to my Komodo. I think if you're a DP or director and you just want a cheap little camera that you can roll out for little passion projects or infrequent personal projects, maybe you shoot a couple a year, then absolutely this could be a really great option for that. It's like an all-in-one, fully functional mini cinema camera that comes with a few caveats, but if you're not shooting on this thing every week, then you can easily deal with the larger file sizes. If you are a DP or videographer that's looking for a camera to use on a weekly basis, this might not be the best option, and I actually think something like an original used Komodo 6K could be a much better buy for people like that. So the ball is firmly in Nikon's court now. They've done some amazing work with the camera so far. They've turned heads with the features that they've put in it. I think they just need to do a tiny bit more work to push it over the finish line, turn this into the camera I think absolutely everyone wants it to be. If you've somehow managed to make it this far, well done. Thank you so much for watching. My name's Ed. Until the next one, I'll see you later.